Okay. Hi, everyone. So welcome to Masterclass 6, How to Debate Development for Mobile Matter. This is me, Vicky Barcelon. I'll be talking about how to improve generally our discussion when it comes to development debates, how to give more, nuanced analysis, more nuanced models when it comes to things about sustainability, development, inclusion, progress, etc., all these related ideas. And the main reason I kind of wanted to talk about this topic is because I myself am a development studies major. In my university years, I debated with Ateneo Debate Society. And basically, I feel that there is still a lot of ground to cover when it comes to how we discuss different stakeholders in these debates, how we discuss different contexts. And yeah, I guess this is like my little contribution to debate knowledge online, seeing as, of course, this is something I studied and care very deeply about. So I guess the first important question here is, what is development? And so, of course, when we're talking about development motions, I kind of use that term very loosely because I think many things can count as development issues. And I think, of course, the best debaters don't limit themselves to what the motion explicitly calls for or looks like, and they try to use principles from one discipline and find connections with other disciplines. So, the motion doesn't have to have the word the poor or redistribution for it to be about development. Of course, there's so many motions that have to do with aspects of development and aspects of inclusivity, sustainability, etc., that are still very important discussions to have, even if it might not be so explicit in the wording of the motion. So even, for example, if you're talking about a motion about a certain law being passed or something like that, of course, you will always talk about how will that law impact people on the ground, as we like to say, or average individuals, how will it affect the poor or most vulnerable groups in society? So, of course, that's a very common discussion that we have in a lot of these debates. And it's because of that I really wanted to give extra focus to how we can tackle these stakeholders, not just in a sensitive way, but in a really nuanced and comprehensive way, because I think that's perhaps what we could still work on as a community. I think at times we're all a bit guilty of being a bit simplistic when it comes to explaining pathways to development, when it comes to explaining context of certain stakeholders and groups. And it's very easy, of course, to kind of use buzzwords and placeholders. And so, again, that's kind of why I wanted to give this talk, is to just really dive into how we can give much more nuanced discussions around these things. So now let's dive into it. What is development? So the simplest definition, I think, is really just improving people's lives, right? Improving, growing, and pushing society to be more advanced. And so this can deal with alleviation or eradication of poverty. It has often a lot to do with economic development, of course, but I will talk about a much more, multidisciplinary approach to development besides just the economic aspect. There is an academic that we dev majors love to quote, and his name is Amartya Sen, and one of the most respected academics in the field. And his quote goes like this: "Development is an exercise of the imagination." And so what he means by this is that development is where we can envision a world that we want to see and a world that, we'd love to live in. So that's why, for instance, we talk about things like urban mobility, urban planning, or even greater things like welfare, UBI, and government support for minorities, for indigenous groups, etc. These are often conversations we have when we talk about development. And again, it's because we want to envision a better world, envision a world where everyone is included. And so that being said, of course, while we want to imagine a better world, the first step is to ask, what is the world we are currently living in, and what does it look like? And this part is where it gets a bit tricky because it depends on where you are and who you are. So, for instance, if I'm someone living in the developed world or in a developed country, my conception of developed might be very different. Whereas for someone in a developing country, perhaps the bar would be a bit lower, right? Perhaps even just things like, for instance, better access to healthcare would be a huge step in development for me, when for a lot of developed countries, perhaps that is already considered a given. So it does depend, right? It's context specific. Another thing is that your culture can, of course, play a big role in how you perceive development. And so, for instance, if we take a look at the typical notion of development, it's that urban areas having these cities and having more and more, like, I don't know, public services and all of these things are the ideal. Whereas for, let's say, if I were an indigenous group or an ethnic minority that resides mostly in, um, more remote areas, perhaps for me, my conception of development would be that I really just want to sustain what I already have or maintain the kinds of natural resources that sustain my community. And for me, that is an expression of my culture. That's my ability to, continue living a good life, right? And so perhaps it doesn't quite look like the majority's notion of development, but that doesn't make it any less valid just because it might be a smaller group that views it that way or that prioritizes things that way. And so culture plays a big, big role in what that notion of development is. And for any, I guess, debate that has issues like these, that's why it's really important to talk about stakeholders, which we'll discuss a little bit later on. But next, development is, of course, interdisciplinary. So what does this mean? It means that it depends on various different fields. So things like political science, economics, sociology, gender, and environment are all different lenses we can use, all different aspects of development that we can take a look at. So for instance, if we were to look at, political science or use the lens of political science, I would look at governance. I would look at how are politicians allocating resources. However, if I were to look at economics or use an economic lens to assess development, I would perhaps look more at how does the market, manage resources? How does the free market necessarily allocate these things? So it isn't about the government allocating resources, but it's about how does society, how does the free market determine who gets what resources? And similarly as well, even for things like gender or race, for instance, these are other aspects that determine to what extent can your life be improved, right? If you are a member of a minority, of course, it is much more difficult to access certain resources, etc. You have much more or many more barriers that you would have to overcome in order to be treated the same way, in order to access a better quality of life. And so all of these different lenses are things that we can use when it comes to development debates. And of course, the problem and the solution will look quite different depending on which lens you take. So yeah, just something to consider. Now, another thing I often tell my students, because I am a debate coach as well, what I tell them is to always look at all the possible stakeholders of any debate. And what do I necessarily mean by this? So what I necessarily mean by this is just to kind of try to be as exhaustive as possible. So even during prep time, I do tell my students, try to really just list any potential actor that you think could be relevant to the motion and has something or has an important stake in the motion. So this is usually like one of the, I guess, cheat sheets you could use. And this applies especially for development debates, but you can use it for any kind of debate. So various stakeholders, things are stakeholders such as various socioeconomic classes, not just the poorest or the most vulnerable ones, but of course, even middle class, upper middle class, the extremely wealthy. These are groups that you want to consider and talk about the dynamics, especially if you're talking about, let's say it's a taxation debate or if it's a welfare debate, right? You need to discuss not just one part of society, but as many sectors as you possibly can, because those all interact with one another. The next is perhaps local NGOs or non-government organizations or even international NGOs. Now, these are groups that often have a lot to do with things like, I guess, humanitarian aid or perhaps, providing conditional aid. That's also another way that we often see these kinds of groups interacting in the development sphere. And usually they tend to fill in, I guess, services that maybe the local government cannot or even the national government cannot. So when it comes to, especially, let's say, motions about post-conflict societies, NGOs definitely come into the picture and are important stakeholders to consider. And next, of course, minorities, very, very important. So it could be ethnic minorities, religious minorities, etc. Or yeah, any degree, I guess, of identifier that may make a certain group more disadvantaged and have less access to certain opportunities. This is an important stakeholder to remember. A big one for developing countries especially is the church or any religious bodies. And this is because it just so happens, right, that developing countries do tend to have, I guess, much stronger religious ties or spiritual ties compared to some more developed countries, which have tended more towards being a bit more secular. Of course, that's not the case necessarily for all, but I will say that's a trend that we can generally observe. Next, of course, social movements, civil society groups, very, very important. I don't think I need to go into much detail there. We've all talked about social movements before. And of course, state actors and politicians. And this can be on the national or the local level. So yeah, general stakeholders, very simple. I think this is just a good guide so that you can easily refer back to this in case, you're looking at a motion and you're completely stumped. Like, who can I talk about? What is this debate about? I have no idea. It's just a good cheat sheet to have just in case, you might forget some of these every now and then. So just have it on hand, makes life a bit easier. All right. So mainly the structure of this talk will go like this. We'll talk about kind of the common mistakes in debates about development. And I find this to be like a very helpful format because it kind of just helps you be more cognizant of things or missteps you might be making. And I try to give some solutions how you can fix those. Okay, so the common mistakes. So firstly is having this conception of development as being only economic growth. The definition of development has changed a lot in the past, I would say even the past 10 years has changed significantly. And we've started looking at a lot of other factors as to, what makes for better quality of life for people, what makes for more inclusive systems and institutions, etc. And so those values are relatively new. So I don't necessarily blame debaters that still have a bit of an outdated conception of development, but seeing as we have so many resources at our disposal, I think it is kind of important to update the definitions that we're using. The second is having somewhat shallow conceptions of poverty or vulnerability. Now, we've all made arguments about what makes a group vulnerable? Why are they uniquely vulnerable? Why is the harm towards them not mitigable or something we can't undo, right? We've all made those kinds of arguments and impacts, but I think there's still a bit of room to further define poverty and vulnerability. I think there's a lot of different ways to do so that often, I guess, are a bit hard to pinpoint if you aren't perhaps more, involved in the development field, which is totally fair. But yeah, that's why I guess I'm adding it to this talk for the benefit of people who might not be as directly engaged. And the third is shallow notions of the developing world. So kind of similar. Again, sometimes people tend to lack nuance, or perhaps they forget pieces of context that are super important, especially for development debates. The fourth is misusing or not analyzing development buzzwords. This has to do with some of my favorite ones that I always hear, especially when judging debates, are like inclusion, representation, collaboration, right? Or sustainability. Like these are all like super overused. And that's not to say that it's bad to use these words, but I think when we do use them, it doesn't necessarily absolve us of the, requisite explanation or analysis. So sometimes people just use these as buzzwords and leave it at that. And so that's just something I kind of want people to avoid if possible and add more detail to their discussion if they can. Okay, and the fifth one is using outdated or formulaic pathways to development. Now, here I give a few suggestions for how you can kind of define a roadmap to development, because you might be asking, since it is so context specific, or since it is so, I guess, hard to pinpoint even the conception of development in some contexts, how do we then go about fixing all of these problems, whether it's environmental, whether it's in terms of, minority representation, whether it's economic growth, whether it's basic welfare and poverty alleviation. How do we fix those if it is so context specific? And so here we kind of find some solutions to that. Okay. All right, so mistake number one, which is only economic growth equals development, or this is like the main conception of development. So here, the traditional school of thought, I guess, has been that development is conventionally just synonymous with economic growth. And it does include it. Like, don't get me wrong, it definitely does include economic growth. And it should. Your definition should include economic growth. But that isn't the only aspect you should look at. So historically, what we've used to measure development are things like gross domestic product. So of course, everything a country produces, all the goods and services and things like that. Gross national product, total value of final goods and services, blah, blah, blah. And of course, gross national income, how much everybody earns, so on and so forth, right? Like, these are very economic terms. And again, they're not wrong. Like, they are, of course, a metric that is important to look at. But when we're talking about development, we kind of want to look at holistic development. So not just economic, but about sociological. What about, all of these other aspects that we might be forgetting? But first, what is the problem with relying mainly on these metrics? I think the main issue here is that it kind of relies on a very outdated way of looking at development, right? So if you notice, all of these economic metrics measure only the activity occurring in the organized, taxed market sector of an economy. And the unique thing about a lot of developing countries is that a lot of our, trade activities, a lot of our business, a lot of the jobs that exist in these countries are often in the informal sector. And these are basically untaxed or unrecorded in market interactions. And so even if we do use, these typical metrics of economic growth, they actually don't show us a complete picture, especially for these developing countries. So like it says here, because of such widespread imprecisions and internal adjustments within countries, many critics conclude that official GNP and GDP figures measure only how closely a country replicates the characteristics of the West, rather than how well it manages its affairs in the indigenous senses of the term. So kind of similar to what we were saying at the start, development is not a singular goal. Like, there is not one clear picture of development that is the correct one necessarily, right? There are a lot of pathways we can take. There are a lot of different iterations of development that are correct and that can be considered beneficial. So the problem with relying purely on economic metrics is that we're forgetting that, developing countries are their own specific context. We don't want to be measuring it based on how we've historically measured, like, these more developed countries, especially those that probably had a head start because of colonization, because of all sorts of like advantages that they had. So it is a bit unfair to measure developing countries based on those same metrics, given that, of course, they did not have that same head start or that same advantage. And so there is some degree, I guess, of neocolonialism if we were to look at just these economic metrics. And we want to avoid that as much as possible. So here, these are just some things that are good to know. There are now a lot of alternative measures of development. So for instance, the Human Development Index is one such popular one. It measures development using a lot of different metrics, such as longevity, knowledge, or literacy, income sufficiency, etc. And usually the highest ones here tend to be Norway, Australia, Sweden, Netherlands, and Germany. I believe maybe this might be a couple years out of date, but at least I remember this was the last one. And the lowest were some like Chad, Niger, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So it looks at a much more holistic picture of what development is, which is like, is the quality of life quite good? Can you access opportunities? Do you have the tools to uplift yourself if you do tend towards, income insufficiency or poverty? And so much more complete picture, I think, of development versus just looking at GDP, GNP. There are a couple of others you could also look at, and I highly encourage you to read up more about them. The Global Multidimensional Poverty Index is one, and another one is the Gini coefficient, which measures inequality within countries. Okay, so let's go on to mistake number 2. And this, I think, a lot of people tend to be guilty of, myself included sometimes. Shallow conceptions of poverty or vulnerability. So here, I think it's really important to remember that poverty doesn't just refer to a lack of funds or resources. And there are actually so many ways to characterize it. And so in the past, you could get away, perhaps in debates, you could get away with just saying, oh, this group is vulnerable because of so-and-so, therefore, if we can protect this group, we win the debate. But nowadays, I think there's a lot more material about what kinds of poverty people can experience, what specific nuances there are. And so again, we should try to use the resources at our disposal. And of course, the better that you can describe the problem or the kind of vulnerability an actor or a stakeholder is going through, the much more compelling your solution will look, because it looks like you've really thought out what exactly is the, I guess, specific problem of the stakeholder. And so automatically, it does kind of make your solution look much more apt, look much more fitting for that certain stakeholder. Okay, so next, here I think are just some ways that we can analyze poverty and, I guess, again, put it into more detail. So the first one is called the income approach. Again, you can do more reading on this. This is just kind of a very simplified version or a definition. Basically, this just refers to purely a financial aspect. Is that person below the poverty threshold? So, sorry, this number might be a bit outdated, but the one, for example, someone who makes less than like 2 USD a day would usually be considered someone below the poverty threshold, right? Now, for the basic needs approach, this refers to someone who, they may or may not be below the financial poverty threshold, but they don't have access to basic needs. So, for instance, you could be somebody that is, so you could be someone who makes minimum wage, but perhaps you don't live in an area that has good sanitation. Or maybe your housing is insecure. Perhaps you have to be an informal settler, or perhaps you're someone who is unhoused. And that might mean that while you are, making some money, while you might technically have enough to sustain yourself, you don't actually have a lot of the very basic things that make for quality lifestyles. So for instance, sanitation, housing, or even access to food. This is, I think, a good example of this is actually in the States, there's a phenomenon called like food deserts, wherein, because in the United States, it is a very car-centric society. If you don't have a car, it sometimes may be incredibly difficult to actually access food. Like groceries and convenience stores may be very, very out of the way for some communities, especially if they don't have access to a car. And so these places are known as food deserts because you actually do have to go quite a bit out of your way just to access like healthy food that isn't like fast food. So that might be one way that we can kind of see the basic needs approach at work. And yeah, it doesn't just rely on like you not having enough money, but it's kind of a bit more about the world around you and whether the world around you accommodates your needs, and does the services that the government provide accommodate your needs as well. All right, next is the entitlements approach. So here, this refers a bit more to things that are not quite like basic needs, but they are still somewhat fundamental for living a like decent quality of life. So a person might not have other things that help him get what he needs to live. So for example, access to financial instruments or savings or financial institutions, having access to some degree of property or material goods, having social connections. This is a really big one that I think a lot of people overlook. So so an example here is like someone who might experience famine, even if there is adequate food supply in his area. So for instance, let's take a look at like a post-conflict society. If you are somebody who maybe just doesn't have the right connections or doesn't know where to source certain items or goods, that determines your ability to survive. Because someone who does have those social connections or who does have some degree of savings that wasn't impacted by that conflict, that person has an advantage over you and they will have access and you will not. So again, things like savings, property, social connections, they really do determine your access to certain things. And even again, basic needs. The next one is the capabilities approach. So this one is a bit more talking about, like, I guess, a mismatch of your resources and the life that you want. So sometimes you might have everything materially that you might need, but that might still not be the ideal life for you, or you still might not have value in it. So for instance, somebody might be very rich, but because perhaps they have a debilitating health condition, it still might be very difficult for them to have other capabilities, right? Of course, that's not to say that they are not better off than a poor individual who might have the same condition, but it is just to say that financial resources are not the main determinant of, I guess, stability and of all of these other opportunities and your access to a good quality of life. So yes, it is a factor, but there are, of course, other things that come into play. And so sometimes in terms of your capabilities, there might still be some limiting factors that prevent you from living a life that you consider to be a good life. Okay. So yeah, so I think all of these approaches are just to kind of widen, I think, the general perspective and conception of what does it look like to be vulnerable and what does it look like to be impoverished. There are so many ways that one can be impoverished, even if it doesn't look like a typical definition of being impoverished. And it's kind of the same reason, I guess, why, for instance, in the United States, if you are unhoused, but let's say you have a cell phone or you have a TikTok account or something like that, society tends to think, oh, but you have a phone, so how can you be someone who is poor? Or you have access to Wi-Fi, which of course is like kind of extremely reductive, right? Like, just because you have a phone, the fact of the matter is you are still unhoused. You probably don't have access to like sanitation services. You probably are constantly anxious and worried about your welfare for that reason. So you might have access to one thing. That does not necessarily mean you have access to all these other things as well. So I think that's kind of perhaps like one of the more extreme examples where people think just because you have one thing or you are stable in one aspect, that automatically means you are not impoverished or that you are not vulnerable. So again, there's so many ways to be vulnerable. And I think it really helps in debates if you're specific about how certain groups are vulnerable. And I think it just paints a more complete picture. It also shows your judge that you've really put some thought into the welfare of that individual or the welfare of that group, and that you have like a deeper understanding of what it is they exactly need. Because again, you can posit a solution, but if the definition of the problem is very, very vague, then your solution is just one of many potential solutions. But if you're very specific about the problem and the exact kind of vulnerability that that group or that person is facing, then it's so easy then for you to paint your solution as, hey, this is the only solution that will work because this directly deals with their main source of vulnerability. So I think it's really useful to kind of have these approaches and general types of analysis in your arsenal, if you will. Okay, so next here is kind of how to define vulnerability. And again, this can apply to, of course, people who are economically poor, financially poor, or minority groups as well, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, so on and so forth. I think one good way to define vulnerability is to say that it is an inability to cope with or absorb shocks. And so shocks refer to sudden changes, things that change without any prior warning, that perhaps are a bit difficult to prepare for or predict. And yeah, if you are not vulnerable, let's say if you're a upper middle class individual, then you probably have things like savings, perhaps something like life insurance or health insurance rather. You probably have social ties that would somewhat benefit you or protect you in times of emergency, right? A lot of people if they have sudden illness or have bills that they cannot pay, they can turn to their community or to family and friends to help them out. But if you are someone who is vulnerable, that probably means, again, you don't have social ties that you can easily access to pull you out of a bad situation. Perhaps you don't have any kind of safety net when it comes to your health, right? You don't have the funds to pay for bills. You don't have health insurance to help you out. You don't have access to immediate healthcare, or even like the basic ability to go to like an emergency room if there is an actual emergency. Like just the cost alone is prohibitive for so many people. And so again, if you're vulnerable, you can be vulnerable to a wide variety of shocks. Now, that's not to say that you define one actor as being vulnerable to all of these shocks. You can be vulnerable to some and not so vulnerable to others. So for example, by health shocks, of course, this means anything to do with your health, your well-being. Natural shocks, perhaps this has more to do with, I guess, natural resources and the kinds of supplies that you can secure, kinds of products and things that you can secure. Economic shocks refers to, I guess, especially things like income or your salary. Perhaps you are in an industry, for instance, that is like blue collar labor, and perhaps to your employer you seem a bit more disposable as compared to somebody who is quote unquote more skilled, right? Which is like sadly the case for many different industries. So maybe in terms of your salary, perhaps if your company or your employer suddenly needs to cut back on expenses, you would be first to go, right? Or your salary would be first to take a hit. Social shocks, now this can refer to like changes in cultural perceptions. This can refer to, I guess, like, sudden shifts in like the social consciousness. And this has a lot to do with culture as well. So perhaps how society treats you depends on, their biases, their preconceived notions of your group. And so sometimes maybe because of political actors, not naming names, Donald Trump, people like that, right? Perhaps now there is much more, what's the word? I guess there's a lot more animosity towards you, a lot more antagonization that happens. So social shocks are something that you are vulnerable to. You can't necessarily deal with it or quench it just by existing, like something that you can't necessarily dodge, right? And again, that's the case for a lot of minority groups. Like, for instance, a lot of Asian Americans were targets of a lot of different hate crimes as a result of, a lot of the discussion of the right about the COVID-19 pandemic, etc. So social shocks are something you can't necessarily mitigate. Of course, and I guess the more basic, broader ones are conflict and like crop or livestock health shocks. So this has to do with, of course, conflict having to do with like global conflict, whether it's like a major war or whether it is kind of like a proxy war situation. Of course, these are things where if you don't have safety nets, if you don't have savings, if you don't have social ties, if you don't even have access to your basic needs, conflict makes all of those things a billion times worse. So of course, that's kind of one of the most obvious shocks. And of course, crop and livestock health shocks, these tend to also have a ripple effect on all of the different goods and things that you need to live a quality life. So so again, these are just some general ideas, but I think just having some of these or remembering to use these when you talk about these different actors really does provide another layer of analysis and provide more depth as to how they're vulnerable, because there's so many different ways that you can be vulnerable. And the more specific you are, again, the more compelling your solution will probably look. Okay. What else? Now, to continue this, right, we're still talking about defining vulnerability. You can talk about things like long-term changes and trends. So this is different from shocks, because shocks are kind of like immediate things that you can't fix at the moment's notice. They happen without any warning. They're very sudden. But when it comes to these long-term things, they happen over a longer period of time. Perhaps there's more of an ability to track these things, right? Because it's an observable trend. So some of these could be things like population trends. So a great example is overpopulation in some areas that leads to things like, cities reaching their carrying capacity, having an overly dense population, and that means that a lot of people don't get services they need. Basic things like that. Resource trends, I think, kind of self-explanatory. This has to do with the scarcity of certain resources or the availability of resources. National/international economic trends, and this has to do with, I would say, a lot of things relating to like aid, but can also relate to things such as debt between countries and international loans. These are things that are observable, and you can definitely have like a huge impact on some groups over other groups. Next is trends in governance. So that includes politics, that includes, local politics, also include national politics. This one I think is a very hot topic now, are technological trends. So new emerging industries and automation impact the poor disproportionately, of course, and tend to impact particularly things like blue collar work and manufacturing sector, etc. But it is also affecting even, I would say, like more skilled work, so to speak, right? So if we're talking about educators, if we're talking about designers, AI is coming for all of us. And so, again, these might be people that are considered middle class, upper middle class, but they are perhaps vulnerable in that specific way, that their job, which had previously been stable and previously been considered a skilled job, is now something that is being taken over by AI or the likes of Chat GPT, right? And so, again, specific kinds of vulnerability really lend more insight into these different stakeholders and how we can protect those stakeholders. Okay, and the next few are a little bit more general, more obvious ones. I think that most people usually, come to figuring out themselves, which is environmental changes, of course, climate change, global warming. The first people to always suffer are the poorest of the poor, or those who don't have access to, coping mechanisms for these things. Technology is another trend or change that we can take a look at. So kind of similar with AI, but I guess it's still its own thing, like specifically tech. How is that affecting different stakeholders and specifically the poor and the vulnerable? And of course, last is globalization, which is the one we hear all the time, and I'm sure we're all tired of hearing about it. But yeah, again, so many ways to define vulnerability. So we've tackled both the short term, which are these shocks, which are immediate things, tend to be more perhaps on the individual level most of the time, but can also be societal. But we've also taken a look at long-term changes and trends that can impact people or certain groups disproportionately. And so again, these are just, I think, great things to have in your arsenal, just so that no matter what argument you're trying to make, there's always like a trend or there's always a shock you can discuss that makes your actor look much more, I guess it makes their story and their concern much more compelling, feels much more real, because you can pinpoint exactly what it is they're facing and why your solution fixes that issue. Okay. And lastly, now that we've discussed what is plaguing all of these vulnerable groups and what is harming them, I think a good question to also ask ourselves is, what do they actually want, right? I think in a lot of development debates, we tend to talk in a very prescriptive manner, in the sense that we're always trying to give people solutions and prescribe solutions, but sometimes we also need to prove that that solution is what that group wants. And there's a lot of good reasons to do that. The first, I would say, is that solutions tend to be much more sustainable and long lasting if the group themselves want that thing or desire that certain thing, because of course they themselves will work to maintain it. And I think that's just one of the reasons. Another obvious reason is that, of course, we don't want to just speak over groups that are vulnerable. We want to actually echo real concerns, right? And I think this is something where, with development debates, we as debaters kind of have this chance to, I guess, be more cognizant and be more responsible when it comes to talking about certain groups. Because while we might often hear the same solutions over and over and just parrot those same solutions, I think it's always good to really assess, is this truly what that community wants? Is there any evidence to the contrary? Or is there any, competing school of thought that we might want to examine. Because, in as much as debate, sure, we want to win debates and it's all about like competition and fun and things like that. The reality of the matter is that we're talking about real people. And I think sometimes we tend to forget that. And because of that, we want to be as sensitive as we can. We want to try to echo what these groups actually want, because again, that does benefit the overall discourse. It does benefit everyone's understanding of these issues. And I think, if anything, debate is an intellectual exercise, right? It's about challenging our preconceived notions. It's about challenging any, I guess, biases that we might have. And so that requires constant examination and re-examination of these solutions and these answers that we are purporting to give to these groups, or on behalf of these groups, right? So yeah, very important question. What do they want? Do they want that form of development? Do they want that form of solution? And so I think there are a lot of good short and long-term goals that you can bring up. And again, these are just general ideas. And it doesn't have to be all of these at once. You can pick a couple of these that perhaps resonate the most. But some of these are social belonging and legitimacy, respect and dignity, the ability to freely express your cultural identity. This is a big one. Organizational capacity is this feeling that they can organize and act as a group and that they have a degree of power as a group. Of course, a lot of social movements want that. They don't want to feel unheard or not listened to. Emotional integrity, so freedom from fear and anxiety. I think it's a very basic human desire. And of course, lastly, political participation and accountability of governance structures. Now, the common mistake I see is that people tend to kind of only talk about organizational capacity or political participation and accountability. But I think it is important to talk about these soft parts, or soft goals, I guess, of social belonging, acceptance, having dignity and feeling that you are respected, etc., emotional integrity. Like, these are still, I think, very important values and priorities that you need to discuss. Even if the ultimate goal might be things like the supposedly more permanent benefits, like political participation, for instance. I think it's still like a ladder that you need to climb to get to those outcomes. And yeah. All right, mistake number 3. So this one is a little bit more brief, but generally, I think there might be an issue of sometimes still having somewhat shallow notions of the developing world. And I will say sometimes even myself, like as someone who grew up in a developing country, sometimes we do still tend to gloss over a lot of the nuances we could bring up. So of course, like I said earlier, development is context specific. So that means that different countries have different forms of development. So for instance, Latin American development is vastly different from Southeast Asian development. And there are so many different factors that might have been instrumental, for instance, in Latin America, but may not have been as present or as impactful in Southeast Asia. So again, when we're talking about different contexts, it's really important to just not copy paste our analysis and try to, stay updated when it comes to matter. Try to ask ourselves, have there been, again, significant changes in the trends? Have there been significant developments recently that have kind of changed the context somewhat? So, I guess that comes down to staying updated, staying matter loaded. But I do want to talk about a couple of unique traits that I think the developing world has that are often overlooked when we have these debates. So a couple of these are, one, that of course, developing countries rely heavily on the informal sector. So like I said, these are market activities that are not necessarily counted in the GNP. These are different kinds of jobs that are no work, no pay, or small scale businesses. So in the Philippines, we have the example of sari-sari stores, or basically like the Southeast Asian equivalent of a bodega. And so these are things that are just operated by, families, small business endeavors, entrepreneurs, right? These are small businesses, but they make up a big chunk of the market activity in these countries. And so it's important to always still discuss the informal sector, the impact on the economy. I think especially in debates about, like, let's say, for instance, entrepreneurship or, startup culture, things like that. Like, it's always good to talk about like informal sector. Like, if you can bring up the developing world and discuss how do those norms affect not just the formal economy, but the informal sector. I think that's like a good addition to the debate to make it more comprehensive. And yeah, so again, because they're informal, because they're smaller and often unaccounted for, they are very sensitive to cyclical and structural failures in the formal economy. So just because they're informal doesn't mean that they don't interact with the formal economy. Of course they do. So other examples might be, like food kiosks that are just locally run, or perhaps even ambulant vendors and people like that, or even as simple as like shoe repair shops and things like that, vulcanizing shops in the Philippines, which we have on like every corner, right? These are, again, such a big part of the market. And like whenever we're talking about any economic debate, it's good to bring up the informal sector and how they are impacted by certain policies. And yeah. Even things like automation can affect the informal sector to some degree, right? Okay, next one is the shadow economy. So this basically includes all market-based legal production of goods and services that are concealed from authorities to avoid regulations, taxes, and the like. So again, a little bit different from informal sector. Shadow economy are things that are like purposely hidden so as to, cut through red tape or to, avoid or evade taxes. And again, this is a big issue and problem that we do see in the developing world, especially in cases where the government is not as, like cognizant of these things, or perhaps has limited capacity to clamp down on these things. So yeah, shadow economy is a very real thing in a lot of developing countries. And so this can come up, of course, in a lot of economics debates as well, or regulation debates are also really important. Kind of like how in any ban debate or regulation debate, you always talk about the black market. This one's kind of like, it's not quite black market, but it's just like there's still like legal goods and services, but they're just kind of under the radar, under the table, if you will. So kind of same thing. You always want to kind of tackle this aspect of developing countries if you can. And many of these are also applicable to post-conflict societies. So especially in places where systems and institutions might be even more fragile and rely more so on informal mechanisms. So very, very applicable to those kinds of debates too. So like I said, context matters. So things like inequality, lack of welfare, lack of healthcare, insufficient education, insufficient checks and balances, corruption, etc. These all differ, and the significance or the impact of all these differ depending on the context. And it's not the same everywhere. I know that sounds kind of basic, but I think it's just a good reminder. And lastly, sensitivity is also key. So because again, we are talking about real people and real experiences that many people might have, it is very important to still ground these things in reality and try not to just let our imaginations run away with us. If you can provide evidence or provide deeper context, I think that's always much, much appreciated, especially by people who do live this as a daily reality, who, can't simply let their imaginations run away with them. But for them, it is a very real experience. Okay. Mistake number 4 is misusing or not analyzing development buzzwords. So it is using development buzzwords without as a placeholder for analysis. And it is helpful to have these words to, I guess they do serve as a kind of shortcut, right? But I think sometimes people might rely a bit too much on them as a shortcut and just do away with analysis altogether. Like, for instance, the most common ones I see are inclusive, or that the certain policy is collaborative, or that it's representative, or lastly, that it's sustainable, without telling me why it's sustainable or how it's sustainable. So similarly with inclusive, why would it be inclusive? What are the systems in place that ensure that a policy is actually inclusive? Sometimes teams tend to forget. So let's do it the first, which is I want to deal with sustainable first. So what do we mean by sustainable development? It's development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So there are different kinds of sustainability, right? There's environmental sustainability, which again has to do with a lot of resource allocation, resource management, responsible even things like responsible waste disposal that makes it more sustainable for future generations to have clean water, to have clean air, so on and so forth, right? So if we are responsible with a lot of these things, we can make a lot of environmental processes still sustainable and still allow future generations to use those resources. There's also this idea of economic sustainability, which means that, again, in terms of resource allocation, in terms of, I guess, like even like the market prices of certain goods, like if we want it to be sustainable in the sense that there's enough supply of important goods, then we have to make it economically sustainable, right? We have to make sure that there's a reasonable degree of access without just completely depleting that resource or depleting the supply of something that is incredibly important. So that's one other thing to consider. So social sustainability has a bit more to do with, I guess, like, again, social ties, like to what extent can you exist in a community and, I guess, like feel that you have a good quality of life. Yeah, I think that's kind of a bit self-explanatory. And of course, institutional sustainability. This refers to, I think, in particular, a good example is like governance. So are the systems in place things that can be implemented regardless of who is in charge? Like, are these things that are these things somewhat permanent or predictable? So for example, like I think a good example, at least for the Philippines, is like how whenever, let's say if you're a local politician, like a mayor, if your term ends and then someone else is elected to the position of mayor, sometimes all of the systems that you put in place will simply be undone by the next administration because they don't want you to have like that credit to your name. So they just undo everything you just did. So that means that institutionally you're not very sustainable. You haven't set up systems that cannot be undone, or you haven't made sure that they're stable and can continue to operate even if a new administration is in place. So institutional sustainability is also important. So again, there are many different kinds of sustainability. So try to be specific about what kind you're referring to and why exactly something would be sustainable. So you need to dive into why would certain actors, let's say, allocate resources responsibly? Why would they dump their waste responsibly? Why would they care about future generations? Does it align with their current interests? Right? Is that why they would thus care about future generations by extension? Because it aligns with their current selfish interests. So yeah, how does sustainability come about? I think that is really the main question, because it's not enough to just say something is sustainable, but you really need to put the legwork in to explain, yeah, like what are the preconditions for something to be sustainable, right? So of course, that I think a lot of incentive analysis, stakeholder analysis comes into play when you're talking about making things sustainable, making sure that they can withstand shocks, withstand changes. Okay. Next one is collaborative or representative. Now, sometimes I think the tendency is to just say, okay, if a certain group has a seat at the table, that is already representative. And I would like to say that in the vast majority of cases, the mere presence of a certain group or representative is not enough. Of course, the quality of engagement matters. And I know as debaters, we like to say, sometimes it's tokenistic representation, or it's just so that you can say that someone from that denomination or that group is there, when in reality, they might not really have a voice. And so when you're trying to prove something is actually collaborative or actually representative, you need to talk about the dynamics between the majority group and the minority group, or the group with more power and the group with less power. So the quality of engagement really matters. This really isn't something you can skip over if you're going to claim something is representative. So for example, let's take this motion. This House supports the usage of citizens' assemblies to determine policies addressing climate change. Now, a good question to ask yourself here is, how would your model treat members of specifically indigenous communities or ethnic minorities who rely on natural resources to sustain themselves? Do they get a platform, right? Do they have reserved seats on these assemblies? Or, for instance, will you as a government create pathways such that they have easy access to voicing their concerns in these assemblies, right? Is it a direct line to the government or to other citizens that you will ensure are there, right? So again, quality of engagement matters. It's not enough to just say, oh, we will automatically have like 2 seats reserved for this community. But you have to explain why it's likely to be collaborative. Again, why are other people likely to listen? Will those reserved seats necessarily be respected? Why would they not be seen as tokenistic? And to what extent would you allow them to even voice their concerns, right? What if, for instance, an indigenous group directly said that, hey, this development, building this like infrastructure or building this highway would directly interfere with our way of life? Are they allowed to express themselves to that extent, right? And if that was a direct concern, how would that citizens assembly weigh that or deal with that? And so these are things you have to consider if you are going to claim collaboration or representation. And yeah, try to be as specific as possible. All right, the next one is inclusive or inclusivity. So kind of similar still to representation. But here you really, again, have to determine the difference between just tokenistic representation and genuine representation and why you get the latter. So I think the best way to prove inclusivity is to explain in your model like why you're taking certain steps. So to account for existing inequality. Like you have to tell me what exactly are those inequalities or those barriers for certain groups, and how are you directly mitigating those things. So such as things like geographical location, cultural identity, social stigma, social norms, or the degree or quality of participation, right? These are all things that could make something inaccessible or non-inclusive to certain people. And so you need to pinpoint again what exactly is inaccessible to this group, and how would you then tailor your model so that you can make up for those things. Now there's an example I like to provide, which is it's an NGO based in the Philippines. It's called Love Yourself. And I think this is a great example of like an inclusive space, because what they do is they actually provide free and discreet HIV testing services. And so because it is discreet, and because it's often like they really highly value your privacy, they make sure not to, I guess, like, take photographs of people who are there, or they try not, of course they don't like publicize people who go there. It's often in a discreet location. The way you get results is also very discreet. Like all of these things are done with the intention of providing testing to people who perhaps are part of the LGBTQIA group, but perhaps don't yet identify openly, for instance, right? And so it makes it inclusive because they make it easy for you to come in to get healthcare that is necessary, if necessary, and for you to be in a judgment-free zone. And so that's I think a good example of being actually inclusive, because you're recognizing that there is social stigma against people who have HIV, right? And so recognizing that and then making ways or figuring out ways to lessen that stigma, or at the very least to spare people the stigma, is one way to make it very inclusive. So I think that's one great example. Another one is like the Safe Spaces Act for the online sphere. So this is, of course, allowing for broader discussion about certain sensitive topics, but make sure that people feel safe talking about these things. That can account for being inclusive, because again, you're fighting against social stigma and perhaps even cultural norms. And yeah, I guess a more traditional example would be this: fair trade initiatives that directly pay farmers above market price. Now, why is that inclusive? It is because, again, it directly accounts for the disadvantages that group faces. So for instance, farmers, especially those who live in, of course, more remote areas, more rural areas, if they want to sell their goods, they often have to rely on middlemen. So to have a fair trade initiative, which will be willing to go to them, shoulder that transportation cost, and still pay them above market price, because that fair trade is not just focused on making money, you have then recognized that, you are being excluded, or you are being, I guess, you are facing certain harms from the typical market, right? You're often price gouged, you're often paid pennies for like a year's worth of work, and then it's these middlemen that make the money. So what these fair trade initiatives do is that they will directly buy from these farmers, but they'll buy them these goods above market price, make sure that they're getting way more than the market dictates, and making sure that they can still live a decent quality of life, because now they have more income as compared to relying on very manipulative, exploitative middlemen. So yeah. So again, that is inclusive because it is recognizing directly what's affecting these farmers, what that direct barrier is, and then directly addressing that and making accommodations for that. So yeah, I think this one is probably like the easiest, or one of the easiest buzzwords to really dive into. And I think it's very, very compelling when teams are able to really discuss what they mean by being inclusive. Okay, and yeah, you can even use this analysis for motions like the following. So this House believes that favorable treatment within affirmative action programs should be based on people's economic status as opposed to their protected attributes. So sorry for the typo, attributes. Or even this House would establish and subsidize gender minority divisions in competitive gaming. So again, it's not like a directly development topic per se, right? Like even like the second motion is a bit more like talking about gaming and stuff like that. But again, you can definitely still apply all the tips that are here to these kinds of motions. Just because it's not explicitly a dev motion or like a conditional aid motion doesn't mean that it's not applicable. Okay. All right, mistake number 5, and this is the last one, is using outdated or formulaic pathways to development. So why is this important? Kind of like I said earlier, crafting a model for a policy motion requires specific stakeholders and actions. You always want to avoid being too vague. And if you can introduce your stakeholders in a detailed manner, that gives you more credibility and makes your model much more compelling. So using things like incentive structures, using trends and historical like reputations or history to make your case more compelling, I think judges always tend to appreciate that. Now, the first solution, I think, to this mistake or to this problem is try to always think about different sectors when you're discussing any kind of model. So are there ways that these different sectors can collaborate or that they feed into that solution in different ways? And I think this, again, just adds more depth to a model, because you don't want a model that just purely relies, let's say, on government intervention, like 100% government intervention, and you have no discussion of how the rest of society is going to deal with that problem, or how their incentives align with the government intervention, right? So I feel like that leaves you very open to rebuttals and to just, if someone can just break down why the government's not suitable for something, then your whole case kind of disappears. But if you do have some degree of like cross collaboration or cross discussion about different sectors, then I think it at least gives you more layers that the other team will have to dissect before they can just fully debunk your model or explain why your model won't work. So what are the different sectors you can talk about? It's mainly these 3: the informal sector, market-based sector, and of course the public sector. So informal sector, what do we mean by this? These are usually, individual social networks or personal arrangements. This is just like individuals talking to one another, or like basically the private sector, right? So social networks. And okay, so the benefit of this is that it sidesteps a lot of information coordination problems, because again, it is just direct collaboration between people. And you have less transactional problems. Now, the issue here might be that you have less formal checks and balances. So I think this refers a lot to things such as, let's say, crowdfunding, crowdsourcing things, just like grassroots kind of movements where it's really just from the ground up, like it's communities doing things on their own, or just private individuals finding solutions on their own or coming together. I think that is often what we refer to when we talk about the informal sector. And like it says, there are less formal checks and balances because these are probably just like citizen brigades or social movements on the ground. So there are some pros, there are also some cons. Another sector you want to discuss and maybe touch on is the market sector or market-based sector. So of course, these are market-based institutions such as banks, insurance companies, financial firms, so on and so forth. Now, of course, these are subject to market forces. So again, if you just focus purely on like the market-based sector of society, then you are a bit vulnerable because the other team could just debunk this and they debunk the whole model. But if you again have some cross collaboration, or you do at least dive into how other stakeholders, other sectors would build up that model or reinforce that model, then at least you have a few more layers. So the pros of this, of course, are quality or efficiency. I forgot to put it in a bullet, but for cons, of course, sometimes it's this issue with like these firms are too big to fail, or they tend to be a bit more shady in their dealings, especially because they have this veneer of credibility, etc. So, that is the issue with market-based institutions. But still an important aspect or sector to think about. Now, for public sector or government, this is the most common one that I think everyone will talk about in a policy debate, right? But again, in developing countries, the tendency with this, and the reason why you can't solely rely on government intervention, even if it's like a policy debate, is that again, if the other team just talks about developing countries and says a lot of these countries can't really handle this kind of model or this policy, then your case could potentially fall flat, right? Especially if they do prove it with the specific contexts, which are very real, right? There are countries that may not have enough funding, may not have manpower, or perhaps are dealing with multiple crises at one time. And so the public sector cannot be the only, I guess, reinforcement of that model, or it can't be the only source of the solution. There have to be other actors that come into play, or that at least will somewhat reinforce whatever the state puts into effect. So you need to be very real about the capabilities of the government for this particular one. And it's particularly important to, I guess, acknowledge as well when other sectors are weak. So if the informal and market-based sectors are weaker and the government is still comparatively better, even if it's not perfect or even if it's still severely insufficient, I think that's an important dynamic to point out, that is why that sector is the best one, even if it's not perfect, right? Because we're not going to get a perfect solution. Like, let's say if it's, improving welfare or alleviating poverty, of course, there are limitations no matter what context we're in. But it's just a question of, are we relatively better off with one sector over another? If that is the case, that we have to pick one, right? And so that's why I think it's important to at least take note of all these sectors so that you can analyze the dynamics between all these different actors. So what are some of the pros of focusing on public sector? Of course, they have the expertise, they have fixed, predictable processes, the power of bureaucracy, if you will. But sometimes that is even its weakness, that perhaps there might be too much red tape, takes too much time to implement plans. Another con as well is that you often can leave out or even oppress a lot of minorities, especially in cases of corruption or in cases where checks and balances are very weak, right? Just because there's a government or public sector in place does not necessarily mean that you are, like benevolent. And sadly, that is the case with a lot of these contexts, right? So pros and cons as always. Okay, so I just want to take this example. So the example of agrarian reform. Now I won't talk about this specific country, but let's just kind of talk in general terms for this example. So here, if you wanted to explain why the government should be the actor, or at least the main actor pushing for this, you would talk about why, secure property rights are something that only the state can fully ensure or fully grant in a legal sense. And on the softer side, the state is the only actor that really has enough power and legitimacy to enforce laws and protect minorities. And so maybe in this case, you would talk about how, okay, the free market perhaps, which has benefited from marginalizing farmers, can't really regulate these things or should not be trusted to regulate these things. And maybe the state has consistently been more objective. So here you are talking about like just directly comparing these two actors. And again, I think that's okay. You don't always need to prove collaboration between actors, but you need to at least discuss how they interact. Like you have to acknowledge that there's going to be a dynamic. And just, I think, countering it early on or explaining it early on is just much better than ignoring that that dynamic exists. And that's the benefit of thinking of all of these sectors, even as early as prep, is that you'll be more cognizant of those dynamics during the debate itself. So yeah, so at least you can make that comparison now that you've acknowledged that those two sectors will interact inevitably, especially in this issue of agrarian reform. Okay. All right, so lastly, these are, I guess, some solutions or some things that you can use. If you do want to look at other ways that we can access development, now I will give a caveat here that these are not perfect by any means. Neither are they silver bullet solutions, but they are just like general development pathways that you can use. But they are not silver bullets. They, of course, still require analysis. They require nuance. You can't just like copy paste it again into any motion. You have to ask, is this actually something that directly addresses what that country is going through, etc. But okay, caveat aside, what are those growth strategies we can talk about? And again, these tend to deal with economic growth. So first, commitment to a free market economy. I will say again, these recommendations lean a bit more liberal. It's up to you to temper them as you will. Second is giving people a stake in development. This is empowering individuals. I think this is often a really underused growth strategy, and it's actually super important, like especially if you were talking about post-conflict societies. Empowerment and buy-in are so, so important. Like, I think that for a lot of more utilitarian benefits to come about, you do have to prove that people have some belief in development, right? Or that they at least have some faith that things will get better. And the best way to do that is to kind of put power directly in their hands, or at least establish collectives so that people can come together and have that kind of support and empowerment. So this one I think is very often underutilized, and I think is actually a very, very compelling like line of analysis in a lot of cases, especially when you run it very well. Second is perhaps industrializing from a base of agricultural productivity. So we usually see like developing countries or those who are still a bit further behind tend to still be operating from an agricultural base. So still very, I guess, entrenched in like raw materials and resource collection, things like that. But usually development tends to become a lot faster when you find ways to industrialize. So even if that's improving farming, even if that's improving, the collection of raw materials, that's still a good thing. But of course, usually once you've moved on to manufacturing and, mass production of products and exporting products, that is usually where we see the biggest boom of growth for a lot of these countries. Now, again, that's not like a copy paste solution, but that is kind of the historical trend that we've seen. And so we can, I guess, reasonably surmise that it tends to work for a good number of contexts still. Another one is encouraging a high savings rate. Now, this one has to do with kind of a lot of the stuff we talked about earlier with the different approaches, that savings comes from first having access to things like financial instruments, or even having financial products that are tailored to people who, again, might be impoverished or people who might be from a minority group. So there are a lot of social aspects of getting people to save and getting them to, even earn enough that they feel that they can put some aside for savings. So this has a lot of prerequisites, but it is one of the ways we can get people to feel more stable and also make them a lot less vulnerable. So it's encouraging a high savings rate. Of course, developing an educated workforce, I think kind of self-explanatory. Fostering export-oriented industry. Again, this has to do a lot with, like manufacturing, industrializing a lot more. And lastly, building solid infrastructure and employing urban planning strategies. And this is very much the case with places that have high levels of inequality. So if you are dealing with like a certain country that has, let's say you have decently urbanized areas, but perhaps there are still many, many rural areas that don't have the same degree of, access to infrastructure, then this is a great solution that you can employ. Or at least like decentralizing development could be a great potential solution. So again, none of these are silver bullets, and you can use them in conjunction with one another. But yeah, it has to be, of course, nuanced to the motion. And so all of that being said, I think it is still important to have like context when it comes to these things, and to use these tools responsibly. And of course, I trust that debaters will use their analytical rigor to determine which of these tools you can use depending on the debate. But of course, do be aware of just outright prescribing like economic liberalism. As August Bebel said, economic liberalism is the free fox in the free chicken coop. And I think that is something we see, especially with capitalism and all these depressing things. But anyway, that being said, I guess the key takeaway here is to just be discerning when it comes to these debates. Try to really just be detailed. I think that if there's any one key takeaway you take from this talk, it's just be creative when it comes to these analyses, and try to really be as comprehensive as you can, especially when we are talking about vulnerable stakeholders, when we are talking about real life issues like this, which is the case with any kind of debate, right? It's just a matter of being as nuanced as you can be. And I hope that some of the tools or some of the cheat sheets I gave will at least be a little helpful, even just during prep, just taking a look at them and remembering like these are different sectors you can discuss, these are different stakeholders, these are different interests and incentive structures you can discuss, right? So if it has broadened your conception of development and of what can be considered a development issue, then I would be quite happy with that. And so I hope this was a helpful talk. And I just want to thank Mobile Matter for having me. And yeah, I will see you all around. Thank you.